Welcome to The East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. I'm Ra Mason, and this is my co-host, Sherzod Muminov.
So, welcome to the East Angle. This is our second episode of the podcast. It is less formal. The first one that we did was a roundtable on gender issues, very important issues in Japan. But this time we decided with Ra to just get together, Ra and I, the hosts, to talk about the podcast, start with the backstory, why we started it and how we want to do it, maybe some of the reasons that we want to look into. We want to mention why we're doing this, and then we will
roll on from there, I think, Sherzod. So the reason really we got started with this, and you'll probably remember better than I, but it definitely began out when I was in Okinawa. You were here in sunny Norwich, and we were thinking, how could we make something that's a bit more interesting, a bit less stiff than a standard academic dialogue or monologue. And we wanted to talk about Japan, wanted to talk about things we were interested in, bring in some topics that get people excited, and also somehow segue almost randomly into football. And so that's how it began. So it began with a beer and a conversation, and now here we are recording the East Angle.
Yes, the mention of football actually brings back memories how it all started. It was basically two friends, two colleagues having conversations at one point. This is like, I'm risking now sounding too self-conceited, I guess, and I guess our listeners will be in their right to think, oh, why should I listen to two guys? But actually what we really want to do, as Ra mentioned, is we want to talk about more serious things, mainly current affairs. But of course, I'm a historian. Ra is an international relations scholar, and we want to talk about mainly East Asia, but also the East, broadly defined from current affairs perspective, but also from a historical perspective. But we also want to do it in a kind of friendly way, in a less formal way. We could do academic talks. I think we will invite academics who will talk about their books, about their latest research. We will sometimes ask them tough questions about what's going to happen in the future, etc. But I think the whole idea is we want to keep it friendly, feisty, sometimes if necessary. So yes, the backstory is, yes, we were talking, and one day we said, oh, you know what we just discussed could be in a podcast.
Absolutely, and now it is. And I think, the thing about this is that not that many people think or talk about Japan on a regular basis. So for us to be able to do that and bring people into the fold and make them realize how significant but also kind of weird and wonderful Japan is, I think this is a great opportunity for people to listen to that. So maybe you could start off, Sherzod, by telling us your weirdest experience in Japan.
Yes, I have quite a few. Unfortunately, I have witnessed some really bad things in Japan, some things that might unsettle people. So and I just kind of a word of warning, we will probably mention suicide. We will mention some unpleasant things, just so you are prepared. I think if I have to pick one, I think something that is referred in Japan as kodokushi, or if you literally translate it as a lonely death or a death at home of a person who either doesn't know anybody or whose contacts or relatives are very far away or too busy to deal with them, usually elderly people, usually predominantly male people who die in their houses. So I stayed in a wonderful suburb of Tokyo called Kodaira. So it's on the Seibu Shinjuku line. It's quite convenient, 27 minutes from Takadanobaba. I was at the time a guest researcher at Tokyo's Hosei University. So one day I was, I think, taking out the rubbish, and I smelled something really weird next door. So it was a flat next door, and I didn't pay attention to it. I didn't even think about it. The next day, I thought, okay, a cat has died somewhere. So you can imagine what kind of smell it was. And I called the building administrator. So and I said, I don't know where that's coming, but it's a strange smell. And I went to the university. And a couple of hours later, my wife called me and she said that the whole group of people have arrived. Obviously, there are some, I think there must be some people from the coroner's office, there are people, police. There was the building administrator and the landlord who knocked on our door, who asked with my wife that everybody is okay. My wife's Japanese isn't, she struggled to understand everything that they said, but she realized that they were telling her that there was an elderly person's dead body found in the flat next to ours. And, horrible as that is, it kind of, for me, the more horrible thing is the fact that we were there all along as that lonely poor person died, and we just didn't know. And increasingly, you look around in Japan, and people just either don't know, or even if they do, they just don't care. These issues like kodokushi, these social issues primarily, that are a legacy of the period of very high economic growth, very hard, long working hours, the breakup of the traditional family, and all those big social developments, that they have left such big traces in Japanese society that everybody is now used to it. I think, in a way, if there is a word for it, if a name has been applied to a phenomenon like kodokushi, for example, or hikomori, parasite singles is probably how they are translated, although I don't think that's a very good translation of hikomori. So, yeah, that's what I thought about. And what was your weirdest experience?
Well, I think I've got a lot. I've been coming and going from Japan since I was 17 years old. But I think what you've illustrated there is something that people really need to be aware of when they think about Japan, because it is a beautiful country. It's an amazing country in terms of the advances it's made in all kinds of areas of technology, and it has fantastic, kindly aspects to its society as well. But there are some very scary and strange phenomena that emerge out of that as a result of these rapid changes that take place. And the kodokushi phenomenon that you're talking about, or the hikikomori as well, where you have these people who kind of go into their room and live with their parents almost indefinitely. These are things which are not so evident in other societies. And part of that is because of this social cohesion that is needed in Japan. So the reason the society works relatively effectively, and the reason that you don't have people beating each other on the street or shouting silly things from windows or chucking rubbish around, the flip side of that is that you have these things where people kind of mind their own business, and because of that, you have these social disasters taking place.
Sorry to interrupt you. You were telling about, I think this was prelude to your own weird experience, but I just can't miss this opportunity to ask you your personal, because we have actually discussed this before. I have almost always, in each conversation, I moan about how people in this country don't respect the rules. And that comes actually in comparison to Japan. What would you take? What is your preference? Would you take a society like Japan, where everybody follows the rules, not because they are so rule-abiding people, not necessarily all the time, but because of the social pressure, and with lower levels of crime, with lower levels of delinquency, lower levels of less trash in the streets? Or would you rather have a bit more freedom?
Yeah, it's the perennial question, isn't it? I've been lucky enough to come and go, and I think people that come and go from Japan to certainly other Western societies enjoy the contrast. But it begs the question, why can't we have both? We've got a situation where you're given this dichotomy, or either you can have a Japan-style society where people are relatively well behaved, but they have, in some senses, at least socially, less freedoms, or we can have a British-style society where you've got delinquency and chaos and decay, but hey, you feel a bit freer. I don't think that's necessary. Can't we have both?
I'm being provocative, obviously, but there is a country I think that has done both things more or less well, and I don't know, Germany.
Well, I mean, that's, what is it? We're now 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week away from the Euros. You're not going to get me praising Germany on our podcast here. But although football is something we'll talk about probably later.
We will come to football. Sorry to, again, you can go back now to your story about the weird experience in Japan.
Well, I think actually, funnily enough, you bring up the German example. We could go into some interesting points on actually the fantastic things that are going on in Germany, and at the same time, the wider kind of social issues that arise there. But we also might want to go back when you're talking about this kind of idea of weird stories, things in Japan which are outside of the box, completely outside of the box. So that you can't really explain from one of those two positions of, greater freedoms or greater cohesion. Things like, for example, I mean, I remember as an older teenager going into a public bath in Japan and suddenly being confronted with Yakuza gangsters, right? And this is in a public bath in Osaka. Okay, with hindsight, probably an area that maybe I should have been a bit more careful. But still, Japan generally, you're pretty safe wherever you walk. You're pretty safe wherever you go.
For those of us, Ra, who have never seen a real Yakuza in their lives, how do you tell? How did it suddenly dawn on you that, oh, these guys are Yakuza?
Yeah. Well, so you expect, right? I mean, if you watch Yakuza films, you're expecting these fancy dragon tattoos and maybe, masses of muscles and a missing eye and a missing finger or something like this.
Missing pinky finger.
Yeah. I actually didn't even notice the finger. If I'm honest, I can't remember whether there was a finger missing or not. But the reason that I was kind of concerned from an early stage was because this guy, probably as old as we are now, but at the time who seemed like a much older guy, obviously, came in, he sat down, and he had two other guys come over and wash his entire body for him. And so, like, in a Japanese bath, public bath, you go in and you wash yourself before you get into the bath, into the large bath, as you know. But normally you wash yourself. You don't have somebody else wash for you. So this was already very, very strange. And his attitude was one of total confidence, and those dealing with him of total deference. And then I was kind of sat on the edge of the bath, and he came and sat next to me and put his hand on my thigh. And I was like, this is very weird.
Weird is I think you could go with a stronger word there.
Yeah, I might go with a stronger word there. But it was very disconcerting, to say the least. Thankfully, I escaped from that experience unscathed in every sense. But it could have been a lot worse. And that's something, where you can't really say that's down to society. That's something down to the uniqueness of Japan and all these phenomena, including the Yakuza that are there. So it's just a fascinating kind of culture and experience to be a part of.
It's quite strange, isn't it, compared to this country? And as we walked here, we were talking about how class-aware and class-conscious British people are, and how, having lived in this country for a few years, I have actually started to notice how class consciousness isn't just in your consciousness, isn't just in your mind, but also it works in the way that the society is separated. Up until quite recently, a few decades, that separation was strictly along the gender lines, and we discussed that last week. You had schools only for boys and girls, etc. But even in every other respect, even, for example, Ra, very well, you play two most popular English sports very well, cricket and football.
Very badly.
No, I mean, as someone, I don't know how you play cricket.
We'll keep it that way. Sorry.
On football, I can attest Ra is one of the best defenders, all those sliding tackles, all those bruised knees. But basically, the point I'm trying to make, that even in sports, or even in the way that people dress and speak and the schools they go to, there is that separation. One thing that came to me as you were discussing this Yakuza who came and just sat in the bathtub with everybody else, although he had his minions who were washing him, which is really strange, he still is using that public bath that you were using. And this is something that kind of amazes me about Japan, because you might be on a train with Yakuza, or probably Yakuza won't take trains. I don't know. Like, you tell me. But for example, I was one of the things I was surprised about was a former deputy cabinet secretary in the Noda administration. And by the time I met him, he was already in a different job. But he would come to the seminar that my professor at Jose was organizing, and he would be there just to kind of to listen, but also sometimes to offer advice on policy, on other things. And it was an incredible experience for me. But after the seminar ends, this guy would take the train, and someone who's occupied, a very high government cabinet position. And for example, in my culture in Uzbekistan, it's unthinkable that someone so high ranking, or at least so high ranking in the past, would use the train just like everybody else. So I don't know what that is. That there is that social cohesion on one hand, but there is also some kind of egalitarianism that you don't normally always see everywhere else.
Yeah, but I think some of that is a fallacy. And I completely accept your point on that. And I agree. I think there's something beautiful about Japan that there's at least an attempt, right, to keep some kind of egalitarianism and to keep a sense of social care for those who are everywhere, from the very upper echelons of society to somebody who is struggling to make ends meet. But I think there is a certain fallacy to it. And why I say that is because, I mean, obviously back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were books about, as Japan's society started to change, there were books about things like, inequality amid affluence and this kind of stuff, right? And what that scholarship kind of revealed was that actually, and I experienced this as well working for a small Japanese company, is that yes, it's true that you can be relatively incompetent or you can be relatively low on the pay scale and still be kind of socialized in a way that you might be ostracized in other countries. But on the flip side of that, for example, if you are the chairman or owner of a very small company in Japan, because of the way the tax system works and because of the way the salary kind of calibration is organized, you make massively more than your workers. And it's true, you probably don't show that off with a massive house or taking a taxi instead of a train. But the reality is that it masks the fact that there is huge inequality between even a small group of workers. And it's made to feel, because you all go and eat together, or maybe you ride the same train together, and the only difference is perhaps that the boss shouts you a few extra sandwiches, or the odd beer, or the odd plate of sushi.
Isn't that more than that, though? Like, usually the boss, who is like paid hugely more than his employees,
Yes.
usually pays for everyone.
Yes, that's true. They will in certain circumstances.
And that's how people justify that in a way.
Yes.
Well, that's why he's paid more, because he has more expenses.
But I don't think there is any comparison between, for example, going to a Japanese style izakaya, which is like a Japanese pub, and buying a bunch of beers and food, between then sitting in an office. And bear in mind that a lot of Japanese workers work well over their paid hours. Yes, sometimes they're paid for that extra work, sometimes they're not. But the boss will often be working similar hours, but be making tens or even 100 times more. And so I think there is a certain fallacy there where it creates an image as if everyone's mucking in together, whereas really this guy who's making all the money is just kind of giving peanuts to make it seem like it's a socialized system.
I take your point, but I also need to mention that I think it's a universal thing in the West too. I don't have the exact numbers, but the difference between what a CEO is paid, what's the average salary in a company. It used to be, I don't know, 50 years ago, probably it was like 10 times the difference. Now I think it's 30, 35, 40 times the difference sometimes between the CEO and an average paid worker. So I think that inequality is there. It's a global thing. At least the Japanese boss will buy you the beer, right?
Yeah, maybe we'll take that.
Yeah.
Maybe on that note, we should take a quick break and we'll come back and think about some of those global changes.
So, having, I think, already moved into global issues, I think this is a good time to bring in the main topic. So, how we are going to do this going forward is 1 month we will have a guest, and the next podcast, the next episode, usually will be Ra and I discussing something quite broad, but something also quite topical. So, for this initial discussion, we thought we should talk about Japan's place in the world, because this is the East angle. Yes, we will also not just talk about Japan, we will also talk about East Asia and Eurasia, if you like. We will touch on Russia too, very briefly. But since we're both Japan specialists coming from different perspectives, we thought, why don't we start by talking about where Japan finds itself? And so I would like to ask Ra, as someone who's studied the country for a long time, who has lived for years and who observes it actually daily, what do you think is Japan's place or position in the world now?
Well, as someone that spends most of their time in Japan, in Okinawa, sat between Taiwan, China, and mainland Japan, and surrounded by numerous American bases, I would have to say that the only way to describe Japan's position in the world right now is as a puppet of the United States of America.
Wow, puppet.
Yeah, I would use the word puppet.
So you think that word isn't too strong?
Not really, because puppet indicates that you have one group of actors essentially controlling another through their agenda. And if you look at how the Japanese government has responded to recent US foreign policy, it's pretty much perfectly aligned with it. And, you could say, okay, well, the people that are making those decisions in Japan have their own agenda and it's slightly distinct from that of those in Washington. Maybe. But there is nothing in the last, certainly post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's very little to suggest that Japan is deviating from Washington's essential policy line.
Yeah, I agree. I take that point. But is it not deviating because it is a puppet? And you said that. I'm just trying to develop this point. Or is it not deviating because the interests actually converge so well, especially when it comes to, for example, the question of Ukraine, or maybe also even China, although I, from history, think that Japan diverges from the US on China more than it converges. I mean, at least it's more than what we can see on the surface. So the question is, is it because it's a puppet? Or let's not keep saying puppet. Is it because Japan...
Well, I say puppet. You don't have to keep puppet.
Okay, thank you. Is it because Japan blindly follows whatever the US does and it is in constant position of, kind of the junior partner who has to show deference and who has to show respect and consult the US before making any big things? Or is this because they don't really have to do much consulting because their interests are in the same place?
Well, look, puppet is a strong word, and I've used it again there. So it is a strong word, but let's be clear. I mean, if you think about aligned interests, that doesn't mean that you don't have one party driving the cart here, And there's very little to me that suggests Japan is setting an agenda. Yes, we've had things like the free and open Indo-Pacific or whatever, and these were ideas that came from the Japanese cabinet. But they were already nascently there, and essentially what the US does is backed by the conservative establishment in Japan. You don't have Japan coming out and saying, this is our agenda, these are our principal goals, and this is what we expect from the United States. Not really in the same way, say, that you do, for example, from much smaller states like Israel.
Okay, yes, which is a very interesting take. From history, I have always looked into the non-standard view. I mean, as you know, the standard view is that yes, since the occupation, even after becoming independent in 1952, Japan has blindly followed, is probably again too strong, but Japan has been listening carefully and kind of taking into account the American position in every foreign policy decision or in every big foreign policy decision that they've taken. But at the same time, there are many examples in history, for example, in relation to China, which is our next point, where even in the height of the Cold War, even as Chairman Mao is ruling the roost, he's trying to sow dissent, obviously, initially between the Soviet Union and the US, and then, of course, also between Japan and the US, and between Japan and the Soviet Union, which is what shrewd and kind of quite geopolitically aware politicians do, and do skillfully. But even then, there was always pushback from the Japanese side, and there was always some kind of a trade-off that the US had to engage with Japan in order for Japan not to stray too much towards China. So I view it as a more complex kind of horse trading, if you like.
Yeah,
like
well, you're
some
right.
kind
You're
of
right. Yeah, for sure. No, you're right. You're right to take a historical approach, and I think obviously you have expertise in that area, and you're right to take the complexities. But if you want a simple analogy, I think the puppet analogy still stands. Of course, I don't deny there is far greater complexity. That's something which goes without saying, particularly in politics and certainly international relations. So I'm not suggesting it's literally a puppet, but I'm suggesting that if you want an analogy to characterize in the 21st century, particularly in the 2020s, if you want a characterization of what Japan is doing in terms of its foreign policy, then it matches extremely closely with US foreign policy.
It does. Yeah, I have to give you that, because especially now, you mentioned 2020s. Japan is not in a good place now economically. Japan is not in a good place, I think, in international politics. Last week we discussed all those social issues, the gender inequality. But I will give you one statistic that is quite recent from this week, actually. Japan's birth rate, which we did discuss last week. We did actually look into some of the root causes of why the birth rate keeps falling. But the latest statistic is that it has fallen to a new record low for the 8th straight year, with 727,000 babies, the lowest since the records began in 1899. So you could look at that. You could look at, of course, the yen. The yen has absolutely plummeted in the last 18 months or so, from a position of roughly keeping around the 105 and 110 mark for decades, to now plummeting to 157 yen to $1. So if we then go back to that big question, what is Japan's position, but specifically in relation to the bigger threats in the region, and what bigger threat than China? What do you think is going to happen now? What will Japan blindly continue to follow the course that is set by the US on China, which is going to be dangerous, because you don't have to be an expert to see that Chinese-American relations are not going in a very friendly and amicable direction.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think if I might tread into your territory a little bit, there's a sense in which, if you look back through history, clearly Japan has tended to align with the current greatest power in the international system. This is a well-established theory. And so by that theory, we would expect to see Japan, as China rises, if it continues to rise, we would expect Japan to begin to hedge its bets away from the United States towards China. We can go all the way back to the Tang Dynasty, or the Anglo-Japanese alliance, or then obviously in the post-war era, the US-Japan alliance, to see that Japan tends to align with the greatest power in the international system. But there are a lot of differences between the current environment and the historical environment. So I think, for example, if you look at the way in which Japan has changed its military posture, its security posture, again, very much to align with the United States, the United States has encouraged, and to be fair to Japan, been encouraged to interoperate its military. So you have a situation, for example, in the Southwest Islands, down towards China through Okinawa, where you have increased interoperability. So in other words, if something happens in Taiwan, if something happens with China's incursions into the East China Sea, or perhaps around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which are disputed, then you have a situation where US and Japanese security forces are potentially able to operate in tandem. And that intensification, plus a huge boost in the Japanese security budget, more than 50% rise essentially in security and defense spending, those things combined mean that it's going to be very difficult for Japan to in any way disconnect itself from US military objectives and somehow lean towards China.
Okay, well, it has to resolve that issue, I think, one way or another. And the rising budget, despite again the Japanese economy having contracted almost 2% in the first quarter of this year, actually shows that alarm, I think. But what do we get? What can we learn from what's happening in Ukraine about, or at least, or maybe I should say, Japan's reaction to how China is behaving with Russia in Ukraine? Are there any clues there for Japan's own future or for East Asia in general with Taiwan?
Well, I mean, again, I think this indicates that we are seeing potentially a break from that pattern of Japan always aligning with whichever power is on the rise. I mean, the situation in Ukraine is even more complex in some respects than that in East Asia. But one of the striking things is the difference, for example, between Japan's reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Japan's reaction to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. You know, these are poles apart, whereas the former was very lukewarm. The latter was very lukewarm. The former, that is the invasion, the reaction in response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, has been very forthright and very much aligned with the United States. So it indicates to us that essentially we are seeing a polarization of different groupings of states, which include Japan. And Japan is very much in this US camp, and it is identifying the likes of China and Russia as an adversary.
Yes. Well, you have to, I think, if you're in Japan's position, geographical position, but also all the things we've mentioned, that China is going to be the biggest concern, I think, not only for Japan. So looking at what's happening with China and Russia, I am absolutely fascinated by how this all has played into Chinese hands in a way. I mean, I'm not saying that the Chinese did something really well, that they ended up in this advantageous position. But if you look at China and Russia, you know, Russia is now, no one disputes this, clearly the junior partner in that relationship. And someone who studied the Sino-Soviet split, you know, the Cold War, in which China was the junior partner. It's just, for me, it's as a historian where in history things happen more slowly. Or at least we historians are slower than you guys in the sense that we don't always realize very quickly what's happened. We need time. We need to observe from a certain distance. It looks like, at the moment at least, and again, you and I have talked much about what will happen to China. I am still very skeptical. I think that there will be problems for China going forward. But I guess it's just a moment in time that we are recording this, that China is in every respect in a very good position in relation to, I guess, not just Japan, not just Russia, as we mentioned, but also the European Union. So Germany is in it, like technologically speaking, at least, for example, Germany as being the leading economy and leading technological power in Europe will find itself in a more difficult position in relation to several sectors, you know, like green energy might be one, you know, electric cars might be the other, AI is another. So how does the world deal with China, I guess, before we move on to football?
Yeah, with great difficulty. With great difficulty. That is the answer. And for Japan, yeah, I think, you know, you have to think that it's doomed if it does and it's doomed if it doesn't, right? This is the situation Japan finds itself in. But certain things have got to change. We know that. We even see that. And we can see, even from government policy, which in Japan has traditionally been very conservative, very kind of slow-moving, you know, even immobile it's been accused of. Even the current administration in Japan is aware of some of these problems, and as we've seen, is beginning to make plans for greater immigration, trying to invest in sectors where it thinks it can be competitive, trying in some way to stop what has essentially been a slow but definite decline since the bursting of its miracle bubble in 1991. And I think we're going to see that accelerated. But that is going to cause all kinds of issues that relate to the stuff we've talked about in terms of sudden societal change, in terms of upheaval, in terms of a total different way of thinking for a country that is not well prepared for rapid and dramatic changes.
Absolutely, yes. Well, my fear is also, I tend to be more optimistic than you when it comes to Japan, but my fear is also that a lot of the things that, for example, the immigration laws that have been, or decisions of the government that have been passed lately, that they might be too little too late. But we can only see, we can only observe. So this is a good time, I think, to stop the serious talk and take another break before we discuss the fun thing in this podcast, football. Hopefully our readers won't find this very strange, but after all that talk about Japan and China and Ukraine war and the declining birth rate, we move to football, and this, I guess, will be the one weird peculiarity of this podcast, that we will always end by talking about the beautiful game. What a time to be alive. This year we have had a very difficult season for both our clubs. So for those who don't know, I'm a Manchester United supporter and Ra is
a West Bromwich Albion fan.
So both our clubs had not very good seasons, although there were some silver linings. But what a time to be alive, in the sense that what a week to be alive, because we are recording this just before the start of the European tournament, Euro 2024 in Germany. And I think we should talk about it because it's important, not only as a football tournament, but also as something that influences, or as something that we can use as mirror to judge the current state of the world. So, Ra, what do you feel about how do you feel about England's chances, being, and I'm assuming here, a die-hard England fan?
Well, strangely, I grew up not a die-hard England fan. My father was staunchly anti-England, so I was taught to always hate the England national football team, hate the England national cricket team, and I've slowly come round to supporting the Three Lions after about 45 years of living. So it's a strange journey.
But a fan.
Yeah, well, now I can say a supporter at least. My hopes for the England team are none. Absolutely none. I think it's the worst England squad I've ever seen selected since I've been watching football at the age of 8. I cannot believe who has been selected.
Can you elaborate?
So why are we missing the likes of James Maddison, Jack Grealish?
Well, injury. James Maddison injury.
But it's not a full injury. He's like we've got 3 or 4 players. Harry Kane is supposed to be injured apparently, but he's still. Luke Shaw. When was the last time Luke Shaw played again?
Luke Shaw is injured, actually. He's actually injured. I'm a Manchester United supporter. I have watched him. He's played, I don't know how many games. Rashford, you could justify maybe leaving Rashford out, but I agree in the sense that compared to who else is there, for example, I was quite surprised why Lewis Dunk was picked over Harry Maguire. I mean, no disrespect to Lewis Dunk, but I think Maguire has always played very well, much better for England than for Manchester United. So you think England have no chance?
No chance.
Okay, well, I have my own kind of beef with England. Not the team itself, but probably with the whole football culture and football journalism. I'm sure you know what happened last week when they played with Iceland and they lost 1-0. And all of the English press blamed an 18-year-old Manchester United player, Kobbie Mainoo, for not providing enough support to...
Kobbie Mainoo is one of the few strange picks who I would completely support. I think that's a brilliant example of a talented player coming through, being given a chance. But if you look at the great squads of history, you know, the Brazil 1970 or Italy 1982 or You know, even more recently,
France 1998.
yeah, or Brazil '94, or look at even the 2000s. When you look through the different squads, usually you have one or two or maybe three amazing young talents that are kind of thrown in last minute to give them a chance. You don't fill the entire squad with random players from mid-table teams.
At the same time, you don't pick a boy and basically murder him after one friendly game, which I think unfortunately is happening to Kobe Maino. I remember when the first year I came to this country coincided with the World Cup, 2006, when, you will remember this, Theo Walcott was that boy who every newspaper was writing about. And I can only imagine the pressure on these young men. You know, they put a foot wrong, and then all of the English press is behind them. And I have to say this, especially if they're black. I think Saka has been singled out, Rashford has been singled out, Sancho was singled out in the last tournament. But I'm just absolutely devastated looking at what's potentially going to happen to someone like Mainu. On one hand, you're happy as a fan that someone like him, a generational talent, especially, you know, the word was used to describe Saka at some point and Sancho at some point. I sometimes wonder if all of that hype is actually counterproductive, because they make a mistake, which is inevitable. Football is, you know, there are mistakes in football left and right every day on the pitch. And then all of that hype just completely goes into the bin, and that young person is basically destroyed by the press. And this is my beef with England.
Well, look at Sancho. You mentioned Sancho.
Yeah.
He's gone back to Dortmund this year, Champions League finalist. Why isn't he in the squad? That's crazy.
Well, if you look a bit closely, you know, how he played actually, I don't think he did really well in. And again, I'm not saying this because I'm on Eric's side and he's a Manchester United player, so I wouldn't say bad things about him. I think just because he's in a good team and that team actually ends up in the Champions League football doesn't really make him a good pick. I probably would agree on Sancho. I would agree with Southgate, but you're right. You're right. You know, I think the selection was quite strange.
It was strange. So who then, if England have no chance, who will win it? Who will be your top three?
Okay, top three, maybe the final. As you said, we don't know the. Either of us.
Exact configuration.
Exactly.
But it depends which team finishes in which group, right?
Yes, but then if we just kind of disregard that for a second, and talk about the strongest teams, obviously a lot will depend on the draw, on who is playing against who, and anything can happen in any game against any opposition. You will remember 2004 in Portugal, who won the Euros. But for me, France is the team to beat. I think I've always liked France, partly because of my allegiance to Manchester United. Especially, I was very happy for them to win the 2018 World Cup with Paul Pogba. But even as a neutral fan, you would look at France and you would think they have a very good squad. They have continuity. I think more than the squad, they have a coach who's been with them for years, who has been in the system for a long time, who is aware of, you know, all the young players, not only the current squad. I think I used to, if you asked me a month ago, I wouldn't put Germany up there as the second strongest team. But I think Germany is back, because they had a very bad couple of years or a year. But now they're playing at home. I think there's a Russian saying, even the walls help you when you're playing at home. So I have to go with Germany for the second strongest team. They might even win it. I won't be surprised if they win it, if, for example, France has a bad tournament or something. And the third team will be very difficult to decide, because for me, I am inclined to think Portugal, but I might be wrong. So Portugal are very kind of unpredictable. You know, you know from the past. I mean, they were holders quite recently, but if you go back to that Euro tournament, few people could predict that they would.
Well, there's only one West Brom player in the tournament, it's Okay Yukoslu. So I'm going with Turkey, and I think we can stop there.
Okay. Well, Turkey, yes, I'm quite sympathetic to Turkey. I've always liked the Turkish players. You know, Hakan Şükür, you remember the golden age of Turkey. But let's see. Turkey might be one of those outside dark horse teams that I don't see them winning it.
I think they'll win it sooner than Japan.
We'll never win the Euros.
When we get a guest member in the Euros, that's who we should invite.
Guest members. Yeah, I won't rule that out. Well, thank you, Ra.
Thank you, Sherzod.
This was a good conversation, and the next episode we will have a guest, and we will reveal that guest on our social media accounts in due course. And thanks to all our listeners for bearing with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA Media Production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.